Oh, hello everybody. Just give me a second. Marianne, Anna, are you here? Just bear with me 1 second.
Hi everybody, welcome to the conference. We're just waiting for our chair, Marianne, to join us on stage, which hopefully she will do in the next couple of minutes, and then we'll get started.
Hello everybody, welcome to the conference. My name is Marianne Stephenson. I'm the director of the UK Women's Budget Group. I know that what's called the conversation mode in Remo seems a bit odd when you first going to explain how that works in a minute, and talk you through the plans for the next 2 days. So the first thing to realise before I go into our plans and why we're here is that Remo has 2 modes. So there's this mode, which is presentation mode, which is very similar to what you might be used to for a Zoom conference. You should be able to hear and see me as the speaker, and you should be able to chat with other participants. So if you open the chat box, which is down the bottom of your screen, you'll be able to see different people talking, and you can join in general chat, and you can also identify all the other people who are at the conference, and you can send them private messages. We're going to be posting in the general chat a guide to Remo for guests, which should explain how to use various parts of the platform that you can have a look at. But the main thing to realise is these 2 modes. There's presenter mode, which is how we're going to do the panels, and then there's a mode called conversation mode. So in conversation mode, you are at a table. Each table sits up to 6 people. You'll only be able to join in the conversation on that table if you have your camera and mic on. So if everyone on the table puts their camera and mic on, you can have a conversation with other people at that table. You can move from table to table, so you can double click on the chair icons on other tables to join those tables and start a conversation there. We've currently got 5 what are called floors in Remo. So when you're in conversation mode, to the left-hand side of your screen, there's a series of numbers that looks like a sort of pad you might get in a lift. And so you can move from floor to floor and table to table on those 5 floors. So if you see in the chat that there's somebody you want to have a conversation with, you can double click on their name, send them a private message and say, I'll meet you on table 1 on the 5th floor or something, and then move to there. And so in the breaks, rather than just, obviously you can go and have a cup of tea and do whatever else you want, but if you want to carry on conversations with people, then we will be in conversation mode, so you can have a chat to people around your table. And tomorrow we're going to be using conversation mode more, so we're going to be using it to enable a different sort of discussion. So I'm going to talk us briefly through the plans for the day before introducing the first panel. So the first session is going to be a panel discussion reflecting on the lessons learned on gender budgeting from across the 4 nations. This conference is part of a project that we have jointly organised between the UK Women's Budget Group, the Scottish Women's Budget Group, the Northern Ireland Women's Budget Group, and the information about to be launched Welsh Women's Budget Group, which is being incubated by Chwarae in Wales. And we have speakers from all 4 partners. Then we have a break where we'll be back in conversation mode and opportunities for networking. And then the second session this afternoon is on the Commission on a Gender Equal Economy, which the Women's Budget Group hosted, which ran for 18 months to September last year. And one of the commissioners, Sarah Veal, will be speaking, chaired by Marina Durano. Tomorrow, we're going to start in a slightly different way. So we will start with an introduction like this, and then we're going to move into an open space format, which is using the conversation mode in Remo, which means that you will be able to decide what theme you want to discuss, and move to tables where those discussions will be taking place, and move between discussions. So there'll be opportunities for people who want to talk about policy issues. There'll be opportunities for people who want to talk about campaigning, and to talk about campaigning at different levels, sort of internationally, nationally, in the devolved nations, or at a local level. And there will also be floors free where people can have their own discussions. So again, if you want to have a discussion, if you post something in the chat saying anybody who wants to talk about this, please join me on this table, then people can go and join you. And that's going to be tomorrow for the first session. And then the second session is going to be on looking forward to a caring green economy, and that will be a panel discussion. So we've got 3 panels, 2 today and 1 tomorrow. We've got an open space session tomorrow, and we've got lots of space for networking and discussion in the conversation mode of Remo. I know it doesn't feel desperately familiar at first, but I think once you get a play with it, you'll start playing with it, you'll start to get used to it. If you get stuck or you have any questions, then you can either put a question in the general chat, or you can go to the first table on the first floor, which is the organisers table, and you can come and find one of the organisers who should be able to help you if you're stuck, or you can direct message one of the organisers. My name's Marianne Stephenson, so you should find me here. And Hannah Abid is running the main tech for today. And Anna Johnston is also one of the organisers from the Women's Budget Group. And there will be organisers on our table from our partners as well. I need to remind you of the hashtag for the conference, which is 4 Nations Conference 2021. It's up when you're in conversation mode. It's up on the board. What else to say? Obviously, this is an open conference. We're really encouraging people to discuss and take part in that discussion, but we're asking people to avoid abusive and insulting behaviour to each other. I'm sure nobody here would want to do that, but if that continues, we will ask people to leave. Usual housekeeping rules for people on panels: keep your mic off if you're not speaking. When it comes to the questions, what we will do is you'll be able to ask questions using the Q&A box, which comes up, it should be down the bottom, or in the chat. It comes up in the chat. So if you look at the chat box, you can see at the top, you've got chat participants and Q&A, and you can go to the Q&A box, you can enter a question, and other people can upvote those questions. So if a question appears like this is a question, then other people can vote on that question. So there's a little number, you can see people are upvoting it, and so the chair of that session will see which of the questions is the most popular to help her decide which to prioritise. We're going to ask people, you can ask a question anonymously without putting your name, or you can give your name, and we'll ask if you are willing to be invited on stage to ask that question. So one of the things we can do with this is if we see a question, we can call that questioner up onto the stage so they appear on the screen and they can ask that question. If you'd prefer not to do that, just say so and we'll just read your question out. We're going to be recording the panel sessions not the general chat, because those are all a series of lots of different conversations taking place at once. But the panel discussions will be recorded, and we will be sharing those on our website. So you might want to bear that in mind if you're asking questions, if you'd rather do that anonymously. So without further ado, Hannah, can you bring our panelists onto the stage so that I can introduce the first session? I'm reliant on the tech here. Whoa, amazing. You feel like you've zoomed in from an anonymous situation. So I'm just waiting for two more speakers. We're just waiting for Diane and Emily, and then I will introduce the speakers and hand over to them. So we have Diane and we have Emily. So this is the first session reflecting on lessons learned from gender budgeting across the 4 nations. And as I said at the start, this conference is a collaboration. It comes out of a collaborative project involving the UK Women's Budget Group, the Scottish Women's Budget Group, the Northern Ireland Women's Budget Group, and the to-be-formed Welsh Women's Budget Group, which is being incubated at Chwarae. And all 4 groups have come together in a project supported by the Open Society Foundations to really improve networking and learning between the groups, so that we can learn from what's happening in the different parts of the different nations of the UK, strengthen each other, support each other's campaigning, find ways, joint projects that we can work on, and ensure that we're not constantly reinventing the wheel. And the reason we're doing all of this is because we recognise that economic policy affects women and men differently, because women and men are differently situated in the economy. To give just one example, women do about 60% more unpaid work than men in the UK, the bulk of which is care work. And this leaves women with less time for paid work and other activities, which means we earn less, own less, and are more likely to be poor. We're more likely to depend on social security for a higher share of our income. We're less likely to pay income tax or higher levels of income tax. So changes in the tax and social security system affect women and men differently. Changes in the provision of public services affect women and men differently. But too much economic policy is dominated by men and based on a model of a kind of default economic male who is assumed to be entirely independent of other people and acting entirely in his own self-interest. And so all 4 of the groups represented here today are drawing on thinking from feminist economics, which really emphasises interdependence and the fact that we are all at different points in our lives dependent on others and have others dependent on us. And this has a fundamental impact on the way we are able to act in the economic sphere. We've got a fabulous panel for you today. It's really great. I'm really looking forward to hearing from them. I'm going to introduce them all individually and then go to each in turn. So our first speaker is Dr. Angela O'Hagan from the Scottish Women's Budget Group, who is also a member of the board of the UK Women's Budget Group. She's a reader at Glasgow Caledonian University, Deputy Director of the Wise Centre for Economic Justice, Chair of the Scottish Government Equality Budgets Advisory Group, and she also coordinates the European Gender Budgeting Network. So it's really great to have you with us today, Angela. From the Northern Ireland Women's Budget Group, we have Professor Anne-Marie Gray, who's Professor of Social Policy. She's also Policy Director of the ARC project, and her particular interests are in social care and in devolution and gender and social policy. Really looking forward to hearing her. Then we have Cerys Furlong, who is the CEO of Chwarae. who joined, I think, about the same time as I started at the Women's Budget Group in 2017. So it's been a really successful few years for Cerys and Chwarae. Prior to that, she spent 15 years in education and skills, and they're really incubating, setting up the Welsh Women's Budget Group. From the UK Women's Budget Group, we have Professor Diane Elson, who's Emeritus Professor of Sociology at the University of Essex, former chair of the Women's Budget Group, and was chair of our Commission on a Gender Equal Economy, and is an advisor to UN Women and multiple international organisations, and former vice president of the International Association for Feminist Economics. And finally, but by no means least, we have Emily Bell, who started at the Women's Budget Group at the beginning of the year and is already pushing us in all sorts of great directions in terms of how we communicate our message to women at a local and grassroots level. She's running the training part of our local data project. And so she's really looking at how we can translate the research that we do into something that's accessible, and how we can help women at local and grassroots levels to access, analyse and use data so that gender budgeting happens at a local as well as the nation level. So brilliant panel for you all today. And without further ado, I am going to hand over to Angela.
Great, thank you very, very much, Marianne. I'm going to try and share my screen. So hopefully that will work. I'm not sure it's working properly.
You can see it, but it's on screen rather than in presentation.
It's not going into. Right, I'll try again. It's a bit glitchy. There we go. How's that?
It's still your full screen rather than as a slideshow.
Right. I'm really sorry. I knew this was. There's always a glitch with the.
We can still see your slides.
Okay. Well, I can see them beautifully on the other monitor, but that's not really any use to you. Anyway, I don't want to take up any time with the tech. So I'll just quickly say thank you very much to the team at the Women's Budget Group for organising this fantastic event. We have a history of Four Nations events. Well, we've had a few in the past, and so it's really lovely at a personal level, but at an advocacy and policy level, it's so important to have these events. And so I'm enormously grateful to the Women's Budget Group and to colleagues from Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, our new coordinators for setting up today. I'm going to give a very brief overview of recent developments for the Scottish Women's Budget Group, with a focus on the policy context that we not just find ourselves in, but have been part of creating, I think, in Scotland for a caring economy. The history of the Scottish Women's Budget Group is pretty well documented over the years. We formed as part of the transition to devolution and the opportunity of a new politics with a new parliament, a new budget process, a new system of government, and all the aspirations that came with that in 1999-2000. We haven't perhaps, as a nation and as a budget process, made the progress that we would like to have made, but we certainly have made some progress, and a lot of that is reflected, I think, in political discourse. We need it also reflected in policy and institutional processes as well. And that's why the support of the Women's Budget Group UK and OSF to build and rebuild Scottish Women's Budget Group is so enormously important and so enormously beneficial. And with that, what we've been doing is, since with the additional financial support, is we've appointed a new coordinator, Sarah Cowan, who's with us today, a training coordinator, Heather Williams. They both started in October last year. Have been working incredibly hard developing the membership through dialogue sessions and new websites, say sessions, a range of speaking and other engagements and activities, including open training on gender budgeting, membership, build awareness across community organisations, build confidence in gender budget analysis, do what lots of us do in gender budgeting, try to debunk the myths of the complexities of budgeting, the complexities of economics, and to put gender analysis and women's experience central to that analysis. And Sarah and Heather, along with the Board of Trustees and Board of Management, have been working on bespoke training opportunities with statutory, third and community sector organisations. And we've been really busy on a range of policy development activities led by Sarah, which included a recent document ahead of the Scottish elections. And our challenges briefing was based very much around the framework of the call to action for a caring economy now from the Commission on a Gender Equal Economy. And that's very much framed and shaped the work plan for the Scottish Women's Budget Group. But it's also had significant and myriad opportunities in Scotland to try to integrate the asks from the Commission's report, which I'll come on to in just a moment. So as well as all the policy outreach, we've been obviously looking to strengthen the organisation. So organisational development also takes up quite a bit of our time on organisational policies, securing charitable status, recruiting and appointing as diverse a Board of Trustees and management as we can, and that's obviously a work in progress, and funding and financial stability and sustainability. The plague of all third sector organisations is something that we are very, very focused on in order to maintain the momentum and the quality of work that we do. The challenges are of a huge scale. The scale of the task is in almost inverse proportion to the limitation of resources. So we are trying very hard to prioritise the opportunities to be a driver for change and a robust challenge to some of the positive rhetoric that there is in Scotland, which is very welcome. But we need to see the action and follow through, and that's why a focus on the budget process continues to be so important. One of the things that Sarah Cowan has been leading on, and it's fantastic to see it here now, is our new look website. So please have a look and see what we're up to and who we're talking to, and come and talk with us over today and tomorrow, as well as in the future. Now, some of the challenges and opportunities we have are in the policy context in Scotland. In the introduction, Marianne mentioned the Equality Budgets Advisory Group, which is an unusual creature. It's a mixture of Scottish Government officials and external members from various equality and human rights organisations, Audit Scotland, Joseph Rentry Foundation, and the Scottish Women's Budget Group. And the intention of this is to advise the Scottish Government and through the officials to the Cabinet Secretary for Finance and the Cabinet on processes to improve and embed gender and equality analysis in the Scottish budget process. It's been around for a long time, it's had its highs and lows, and is very engaged in something else that's very distinctive to Scotland, which is the Equality Budgets the Equality Budget Statement, which is now the Equality and Fairer Scotland Budget Statement. And so we've been working on improving that, learning lessons, trying to drive a more agile equalities analysis process within the Scottish budget process. Recommendations have just gone up to the Cabinet Secretary and will go back up to the new Cabinet Secretary or the reappointed. We'll find out in the next few hours. We'll find out in the next few hours, because we have a new Parliament in Scotland, a new and very much more diverse Scottish Parliament. We have lots of new MSPs, and we will have lots of new ministers to be working with, seeking to inform and build their knowledge on the importance of equality, gender analysis in the Scottish budget process, and the scrutiny of the budget process and outcomes in which Scottish Parliament and parliamentarians should be engaged through the committees and in plenary. We're trying to ensure that we take an intersectional approach to our analysis at the Scottish Women's Budget Group, and that's part or aligns with wider developments in the policy context, being driven by the National Advisory Council on Women and Girls and its focus on intersectionality. In relation to one of our core focus and topics of focus today and tomorrow at this event is social care. And in Scotland, in common with many other parts of the UK, but with our own distinctiveness, we have some very important opportunities and political opportunities around the review of social care. The recommendations from the Commission on a Gender Equal Economy, as I say, have framed how the Scottish Women's Budget Group is approaching our advocacy and informing and our training. The alignment that there is with the Feely review commissioned on social care, the forthcoming SNP Commission on Fairness and Social Justice, which is also recommending a national care service, along with what we're hearing from the Scottish Government and elsewhere around a national care service. So that focus on care as social infrastructure and supporting economic and individual well-being is very much part of the political and policy narrative at the moment, as expressed by the Social Renewal Advisory Board and the Economic Recovery and Implementation Plan. And I have links of all of these in the last slide, so we can make them available to everybody. A very important development that is very new is the commitment to the incorporation of international human rights law that will mean the incorporation of the Convention for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. The UN Convention on the Rights of the Child has already been passed by the Scottish Parliament, although has been challenged at the UK level. UN Convention on the Rights of Disabled People, Convention on Racial Discrimination, and the Convention on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. So we are on the cusp of another potentially really significant leap forward in the next parliamentary session. And the drive underpinning this comes as well from the Open Budget Programme and the commitment of the Scottish Government to improve fiscal transparency. Many of the recommendations coming out of that project also align with SWBG asks and also with EBAG, with the Equality Budgets Advisory Group, recommendations for action from the Scottish Government. And of course, again, in common with our sister organisations, a focus on COP26 and the opportunities of a feminist New Deal, the narrative and policy framing on just transitions and financing for development. So as I say, we're not short of opportunities, we are short on resource, but not on energy and goodwill. And that's very much what today and the next couple of days are about. And I really look forward to working with colleagues across the UK and internationally on learning, building our knowledge reserves, reinforcing our energy reserves, and working on these issues with you all. So I'll stop for now and happily take questions later.
Thank you very much, Angela. That was brilliant and really, really amazing kind of condensing of all the fabulous things that I know you've been doing over the last year or so. So I'm going to hand straight over to Anne-Marie, who's going to talk about what the Northern Ireland Women's Budget Group is doing at the moment. Oh, and just before you start, it's been mentioned, if you're watching, if anybody's got slides to share, if you see there's a little full screen button, you can see it above each of the speakers when they're speaking, and you can see it above the slides when they're sharing. If you click on that, then that means that person or that person's screen share occupies your full screen, so you can see slightly better. Anne-Marie.
Thank you. So can you see my slides, Marianne?
Not yet. You have to go into slide share.
Yeah,
so down the bottom on screen sharing. Can you see that?
Hold on. What about now?
Not yet. Yes,
Sharing?
we can see it now. Yes, we can see it now. So to the audience, above Anne-Marie's slides, you should see a little full screen button, the 4 arrows pointing outwards. If you click on that, that will enlarge that screen so it takes up more of your screen and you can see it better. Thanks,
Marianne. I'm really delighted to be at the conference today and to be taking part in the discussions. I think that whilst things aren't perhaps so positive in Northern Ireland as they are in Scotland, we've certainly got a long way to go. I do think that we have some grounds for optimism and we can see some opportunities. And certainly the Northern Ireland Women's Budget Group, led by Lynn as chair and Alex as the coordinator, have done so much to stimulate discussion, I think, to ensure that gender budgeting is part of, you know, almost everyday parlance in a way that the CEDAW has, for example. And I think that's really, really important, that this has to be seen as something that's really relevant to the lives, of, you know, the everyday lives of people. So just briefly then to say some of the things that we're up to. We do have a research project which is funded by the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust. It's a 2-phase project, and we're currently in the quite early stages of the 2nd phase. And this is a partnership between Ulster University, the Northern Ireland Women's Budget Group, and we're very fortunate to have Angela as part of our research team advising and directing us as well. And I think the research report is important because, you know, one of the things that we did lack in Northern Ireland was really a strong gendered analysis of many of our policies. So I think, you know, from that purpose, it's really important, but it also gives us a presence, I think, in the Women's Budget Group that we maybe wouldn't otherwise have had. It's probably worthwhile saying something just about the context, because it is a different context. It should actually be a positive one for gender equality, because the Belfast Good Friday Agreement did commit to addressing fundamental gender equalities and to the participation of women. But of course, more than 20 years on, you know, we see that equalities persist, that they're very deeply embedded in our social and economic institutions. And the examples on the slide are just some examples of the persistent labour market inequalities. But I think what's equally important is that we haven't seen that investment in social infrastructure. We're the only part of the UK still without a childcare strategy. We have had no reform of the adult social care system, and I know that's an issue across the UK, but in Northern Ireland particularly, social care has been really neglected. And of course that means that there has been an additional burden then on women as paid and as unpaid workers. There is an additional imperative to addressing gender equality in Northern Ireland, and that's because, you know, the international evidence tells us that better gender equality, greater levels of gender equality is likely to make peace more sustainable. But equality is a very deeply contested issue in Northern Ireland, so the equality landscape is really quite distinct than other parts of the UK. When people talk about equality in Northern Ireland, it's largely talking about community rights, the rights of the 2 main religious communities, very often presented as a zero-sum game. In many respects, to many people, equality is not a good word. There's strong political and ideological divisions on fundamental gender equality issues. I think that's very visibly represented. People will know about all of the debates and that there's been about reproductive rights and the resistance to policy change. But that's just one example. You know, there are many, many, many other examples of where there has been resistance to progress on gender equality. And I think that the lack of progress on equality has to be considered in the context of the structure of our government. It's a mandatory coalition. There's been frequent suspensions and collapses of the Assembly. And I think all of that has led to what we would call a lowest common denominator approach to social policy making. So very often it's policy is about what can be agreed rather than what's best. So overall, it's a challenging context, I think, at first sight, but nevertheless, there are opportunities and we need to take those opportunities. I think we see some of the potential for influence coming from the first phase of the research project. So this was really where we were trying to scope out what's the existing knowledge of gender budgeting amongst officials, civic society organisations, public bodies. So what that told us is that there's a lack of knowledge, but not actually a lack of interest. And officials are interested in knowing more about gender budgeting. And I think that's good. There's a very clear problem of gender neutrality. That was a really striking finding. And that's linked to the way in which our statutory equality duty, Section 75, has been misinterpreted in Northern Ireland. And that's resulted in some very poor practice with regard to equality impact assessments. One of the things that policymakers frequently said to us was that they were concerned that gender budgeting meant more new legislation, more new tools, more work, more bureaucracy. And I think the fact that that isn't the case gives us something to work on. There are the obvious practical obstacles that people talked about, the one-year budget, the absence at the moment of political commitment. But what we did find was a real appetite for practical tools and examples of gender budgeting, a lot of interest about what's happening in Scotland, for example, and what's happening internationally. And I think that's has helped us to design phase 2 of the project. And overall, we identified a need to build the competence and to build the capacity of government officials and civil society. And I think that's something that the Women's Budget Group can certainly contribute to. So we do have the institutional and the legal architecture to enable gender budgeting in Northern Ireland. Section 75 is not deficit legislation. The interpretation of it has been, and the application of it has been very lacking. But if that was to be addressed, then this could be a very, very useful mechanism for gender budgeting. We don't yet have a high-level commitment from the executive, but I think progress has been made. Important alliances are being built. So the Women's Budget Group has been working very hard, building relationships with academics, with other civil society organisations, with politicians. So the Women's Caucus of the Northern Ireland Assembly is, at the end of the month, hopefully, is going to bring forward a motion on gender budgeting to the Assembly and has got agreement in the caucus to that. We've been working also with the Chief Executives Forum and with one of the main accounting organisations. And that I think that is also something that we shouldn't underestimate the importance of. Many of there are finance directors in our government belong to the accounting organisations. It's a good way to influence them. It's also a good way to, it does a lot of work globally and is very, very interested in gender budgeting and placing a lot of weight on it. So it is really good to work on alliances like that as well. One thing that is happening in Northern Ireland on a very positive note is that a number of new social inclusion strategies are currently being developed, including a new gender equality strategy. Now, the intention is that those will be legislated for by December 2021. An expert group on gender equality has reported to the government on the evidence underpinning such a strategy, and gender budgeting has been identified as something that should underpin such a strategy. So I think that's quite positive, and we do need to continue to work to make sure that stays on the agenda for the gender equality strategy. The principles of gender budgeting and the methods of gender budgeting is also a good fit for the outcomes-based approach, which is being adopted by the Northern Ireland Executive in the programme for government. So I think that's also something we can build on. And we do have a bit of a renewed focus on transparency and accountability in financial operations, and that's come in the wake of a public inquiry into a scandal in Northern Ireland around a renewable heat incentive. So I think there's definitely opportunity, there's definitely potential. Our political structures, our climate is still of concern, but there will be an election in May 2022, and I think politicians will be mindful of that, and we can contribute obviously around pressure, manifestos, and so on there. So just quickly then, a word on one of the most recent outcomes, I suppose, from the research, and that is that given the appetite for more practical information about gender budgeting, we have decided to take a number of policy areas and apply a gendered analysis and look at what difference a gender budgeting approach would make. So we chose apprenticeships as a start. The reason for that is that over a period of a number of strategies in Northern Ireland, there's been really very little positive change. And it seemed that the apprenticeships were really reflecting just existing labour market inequalities. And we felt that a gendered analysis of apprenticeship policy would help us to identify then what steps needed to be taken. So our analysis covered the two main apprenticeship groups in Northern Ireland, the levels 2 and 3, and then the higher level apprenticeships. And of course, you know, the data has told us that there is a major problem here, that men are the majority of participants in apprenticeship programs, that their representation is increasing year on year, but women's is decreasing. And particularly the apprenticeships at the higher level are being dominated by men. So you can see on the slide here that it's very clear that men study subjects which are linked to the higher productivity sectors in comparison to women. You know, there's a value attached to GVA, and that value, men are seen then as contributing more to the productivity, as contributing more to GVA. And you know, that comes through the funding model, because the funding model prioritizes the apprenticeships in the areas which are traditionally dominated by men. And there's quite a striking difference in terms of the kind of apprenticeships which are funded at the higher level, of very, very significant gender differences there. One of the problematic factors that we identified in this analysis is that a lot of what has been identified as a priority focus in Northern Ireland has come from something called a skills barometer. And this is something that the government asked economists within our university actually to develop. And that barometer is used to identify and to prioritise training in line with the forecasting of skills required for economic growth. And it's very, very traditional in its approach. It's very focused on occupations and skills which are allied to manufacturing and production, and a complete failure to conceptualize that social care, for example, has any economic value. So it's remained completely unresponsive to an impending, not just impending, an actual skills crisis in the social care sector in Northern Ireland, where, you know, like many other parts of the UK, the recruitment of staff, the retention of staff is at a critical level. It's a hugely important sector in Northern Ireland. So the adult social care sector represents 5% of all jobs, so a very critical area of employment. It makes a very significant contribution to GVA. These are mostly women workers. They're really poorly paid. So on average, they earn half the FTE wage. Only about 50% of workers hold any relevant qualification, and most of them are employed by the statutory sector. So the majority of those employed by the independent sector don't hold any qualifications. So addressing this issue of qualifications and so on in social care would make a huge difference to addressing gender inequality in the workplace. There's a real need then to rebalance the higher level apprenticeship framework to acknowledge the economic contribution which care-based professions make to the Northern Ireland economy. We were actually ahead of the game in Northern Ireland in that registration of social care workers, not just social workers, is required, it's mandatory. But the problem is that that registration is not qualification-led. So if we can use this information, we're working with the Northern Ireland Social Care Council, we're lobbying government, etc., to accept that that needs to happen. That would then allow a career framework, a qualifications framework to be put in place, which needs then to be allied to pay. One of the challenges that we encounter is that when we raise this with the Department for the Economy, which is the department which looks after apprenticeships and training, their first response automatically was, that's not an issue for us, that's a care issue, so it's the Department of Health. And I think that's an indication of how reluctant they are to see social care as a major contributor to the economy. But nevertheless, as Angela has said, I think there's an impetus on governments across the UK to really address what is now a crisis in social care. And I think that in the Women's Budget Group, we can take this opportunity, particularly post-COVID, to use as example to show how gender budgeting can really make a difference. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anne-Marie. And I think just those, oh, my camera appears to be off. Examples from Scotland and Northern Ireland reinforce something that, everyone working on gender budgeting around the world has known and said for a long time, which is context is everything. What you can do and what the opportunities are and what the barriers are so specific to the specific context in which you're doing this work. So now we're going to hear from Cerys about the about to spring onto the scene Welsh Women's Budget Group. Cerys.
Great, thank you. And I'm going to try and share my screen. There we go. So yeah, great to follow our colleagues in Scotland and Northern Ireland and hear about you guys and your work, and continue to learn from you, because as Marianne said at the outset, we are a little bit behind the curve in Wales in some ways, but pleased to now have a Wales Women's Budget Group almost wholly constituted, and we've got a great steering group, number of people I know attending today from that steering group. So I should say a little bit by way of introduction about Chwarae and myself, and why we're passionate about this project and so keen to work in partnership across the 4 nations. Our organisation, Chwarae, has been around in Wales for almost 30 years. We're Wales' leading gender equality charity. We work very closely with government in a range of ways, but we also feel very passionately that it's important that Wales also has its own independent women's budget group, separate from any individual organisations or institutions, including universities. So hence the opportunity from Open Society Foundation to work with the other nations of the UK to form our own women's budget group is so welcome, and that's where we are at the moment with the steering group, establishing ourselves as an independent organisation, but already making some great progress, particularly thanks to our project coordinator, Rebecca, who's been with us now for most of this year. And a lot of similarities with some of the things that have been said already, and Angela talked at the outset about the gap really between warm words or rhetoric and how we really embed in policy and institutional processes gender budgeting and a much deeper understanding of the impact, as Anne-Marie has just talked about, of different interventions on women in Wales. And we've now had devolved government for over 2 decades. What started as the National Assembly for Wales is now our Senedd and its own parliament, and we had elections just 2 weeks ago to elect a new Welsh government. And it really has matured as an institution in many ways, but not necessarily as fast as we would like when it comes to gender budgeting. And certainly I think, when I reflect on what Angela was saying around moving from warm words to really embedding. This is a great opportunity for us in Wales to contribute to that. There is very receptive government and opposition parties to thinking about how we can make great strides around gender equality. I'll talk a bit about that in a moment, but not always an appetite or understanding for what that means about what we need to do differently on a very practical basis. And I think it's important that we have the strength and independence of the Wales Women's Budget Group to really help support the changes that we want to see. So as part of the new election that we had just 2 weeks ago, we have a new Minister for Social Justice, Jane Hutt, who's been a passionate supporter and campaigner and former director of Chwarae for gender equality in Wales. And I think there's a great opportunity to work with her and her team to really establish the budget group and its work. So I'll talk a bit about who we are and what we do. And as it says, we're new, independent, not-for-profit organisation which brings together leading economic thinkers, academics and policy makers and key women's networks and women's organisations in Wales. So we will eventually become just another member or a trustee of the Wales Women's Budget Group and not a lead organisation. And that's really important to me personally and to our organisation, that it does have that status and legitimacy and independence. And our aim is to work with government and civil society in pursuit of a more prosperous and equal Wales, ensuring that the impact of taxation and spending is fair and gender equal. And for all of the illustrations that we've had already, we know that that's not the case already in Wales. And so we know that there's really important work to be done, and we aim to be a considerable part of that. So I want to talk a bit about kind of where we are now, the context in Wales, and how things might change and some of the challenges that we face. It is a really key time for new impetus for gender budgeting in Wales with the new Senedd, a new programme of government, and our First Minister Mark Drakeford has said key members of that cabinet, including Jane Hutt, our Minister for Social Justice. We have some really important legislation in Wales that provides a really useful backdrop and framework for us to make the strides that we want to make. And you'll hear tomorrow from Sophie Howe, who's the world's first Future Generations Commissioner, a key bit of legislation that the previous Welsh Government passed, Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which requires public bodies in Wales to think about the long-term impact of their decisions, to work better with people, communities and each other, and to prevent persistent problems such as poverty, health inequalities, climate change and gender inequality. So it has 7 key aims, including a more equal Wales, and that provides a really useful backdrop for us to have those conversations and challenges across public services, not just with government. We also in 2019, say we, because we did the work for Welsh Government, published the Gender Equality Review after then First Minister Karen Jones set out his ambitions for Wales to be a world leader for gender equality and for Welsh Government to be a feminist government. So colleagues across the sector, led by us as an organisation, set out some really challenging recommendations for government, and particularly were keen to ensure that they weren't just focused on policy areas and priorities and how those should be implemented, but actually looked at as Angela was talking, the institutional processes that sit within Welsh Government and how actually fundamental change to those was also required to achieve the ambitions that the First Minister and Welsh Government have set out. And so key recommendations in the review, which perhaps I'll put a link to in the chat later, include a systematic approach to gender budgeting, training in gender budgeting for ministers and officials. That was quite a difficult one to get through because we were told repeatedly, you can't say that ministers need to be trained, and we said they do, but it's in there. and also work around strengthening of equalities impact assessments, and I'll touch on that in a sec. And then we're also, just to mention, the budget improvement plan. So strategic budgeting department within Welsh Government has a budget improvement plan which discusses expanding gender piloting further across a range of portfolios in Welsh Government in a way that aligns with the ambitions set out in response to the Gender Equality Review recommendations. And Welsh Government does have an action plan that sets out how they're responding to those. And here it's really about how we develop a Welsh approach to gender budgeting, and how we do that in partnership with a range of organisations, not least the budget group, but also the Wales Centre for Public Policy and other experts as needed. And then lastly, and quite recently, Welsh Government are beginning to scope out and potentially consult on the creation of, they haven't decided whether to actually call it this yet, but an equalities evidence unit. So they recognise, particularly in the context of COVID over the last 18 months, that as we all know, the impacts of COVID have been felt very unequally by different communities and individuals right across our nations, and they have helpfully recognised and picked up on recommendations from the Gender Equality Review, which suggests that actually building capacity around gathering and analysing equalities evidence would really enhance their ability to implement policy in a much more impactful way. So some really good opportunities there in which we hope to take advantage, but obviously some challenges as well. And as perhaps you won't be surprised to hear, COVID has really delayed the rollout of the Gender Equality Review and the actions and recommendations that set out. And there was some considerable momentum around that at the latter end of 2019 and into 2020, and then of course the pandemic hit. And despite us pointing out the clear evidence of the unequal impact of COVID and highlighting that obviously from our perspective this is very much the time to focus on reducing inequality, officials were sort of dispersed to deal with the COVID response and put their hands up and said, we have taken our eye off the ball here, and perhaps progress has not been as fast as we would have liked. So there's work going on now around how we can reset that and regain that momentum to address the clear recommendations that have been made. There's some clear challenges also within the current budget process. These were identified within the Gender Equality Review, which looked explicitly at that disconnect between policy and budget processes, particularly a lack of engagement from equality lead persons who are key part of the internal infrastructure for equalities in the budget process, but sit quite removed from those budget officials. And then there has been some work ongoing in Wales over the last couple of years around impact assessment and strategic integrated impact assessment. This is the main document that sets out how various impact assessments have been carried out and included as an annex, but there's little read across into the main budget narrative. So quite a big job to do, both for ourselves first, but then working across civil society and with academics and others to really improve people's understanding of even how that budget is set and implemented it in Wales. And so we've got some capacity building challenges, I think, which we're keen to support and address. What we do see, and I think this is a common feature and just demonstrates the need for the Women's Budget Group, is a real limited use of equalities analysis. So even where there is evidence there, it's hard to see how that has been linked to spending decisions in Welsh budgeting. In 2019, a cross-committee report considered the impact assessment done on the Welsh Government annual budget, concluded that it didn't provide an effective analysis of spending decisions and could arguably be failing to fulfil its legislative requirements as a result. So there has been some strong critique, and I think we need to move from that into much clearer action. And lastly, just to mention the Budget Advisory Group for Equality is fondly called Beige, which doesn't have a clear remit or terms of reference in Wales. It is rarely really the group that's engaged at a point where they can meaningfully support the analysis of budget plans. So there is an ongoing review of Beige as we understand it. I think we have some concerns that some of the reforms of that might actually be further detrimental, perhaps widening its remit membership, which could dilute focus on equality. So it's going to be really interesting to see how this all fits together over the coming months and years in Wales. And then I just wanted to mention gender budgeting pilots. So something that was committed to within the recommendations following the gender equality review. And Welsh Government selected personal learning accounts as a new programme to pilot gender budgeting. So personal learning accounts are funded by Welsh Government, and it allows people who meet the criteria to access courses and professional qualifications that develop skills and help you progress or change your career path. And so a gendered assessment of the uptake of personal learning accounts was undertaken in 2019-20. That pilot has now concluded, but the evaluation is still outstanding. So really waiting to see what that has to say, and some key considerations looking at how it differs from an equalities impact assessment, what gender budgeting tools were actually used, that's not clear, if at all. How was gender budgeting used to influence strategy, and what can we learn to take into plans for a second and further more ambitious pilots around gender budgeting in Wales. So as the sort of suggested, a fertile environment for us to work in. And then lastly, really, just to say a little bit about the next steps towards gender budgeting strategy in Wales. In the short term, said more pilots to embed gender budgeting with aims, methodologies and evaluations developed and shared with key actors and agencies there. Looking for greater consistency in equality impact assessment. Strengthened integrated impact assessment tool could be used for the budget, as well as policy development and all submissions to the Treasury, but we need to get back with this momentum, as I said, to ensure that those things happen. Real appetite for gender budgeting training, which could be rolled out to ministers and officials within the Treasury and financial roles across Welsh Government. And then, as I mentioned, the review of the Budget Advisory Group on Equalities Beige to have an evidence-based approach and really be brought into budgetary decisions at all stages of the process. And then longer term, hoping to get to a position where we have a Welsh approach to gender or equalities budgeting, and that's to be developed in partnership with experts and within the context of a wider equalities mainstreaming approach, which was very much at the centre of the recommendations made in the Gender Equality Review. And the future, hopefully, is that we will have a legal framework that includes statutory duties related to equality. We have the Wales Women's Budget Group, of course, established, and many other engaged actors for critical analysis of that capacity building that we want to see in Wales. So we've got new government, new term, hopefully a new outlook, and we really want to make sure that gender budgeting is a key focus of the recovery in Wales from COVID and the likely ongoing challenges for our economy as a result, and for many women. And I think that's just about it from me. So I'm going to stop sharing my, and hopefully come back to you.
Thank you very much, Cerys. That was fantastic. So what I'm going to do is move straight on now to Diane Elson, who is speaking on behalf of the UK Women's Budget Group, of which she is a former chair. Diane.
Hi. I have not got any lovely slides like my predecessors have, but I wanted to have a chance to reflect on what they were saying and make some responses. And I thought it was more easy to do that if I hadn't predetermined what I was going to say with slides. I should say it's wonderful to have this interaction again with the colleagues from Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales. The one in Scotland I've enjoyed over many years. The ones in Northern Ireland and Wales more recently developed, especially through the work of the Commission, which you're going to hear more about later this afternoon. But it's always very energizing, I think, to hear from you in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, not least because your political context is different to the political context in England and facing the UK government. Because although you've all got challenges that you face, I think you've all got more openings and opportunities, because at least you've got governments that do think inequality, gender inequality, racial inequality is important and exists. Whereas at the moment, I feel in London, we have a government that doesn't think that racial inequality and gender inequality is built into institutions and structures and processes, and tends to reduce it all to matters of personal choices. And inequalities of place are what matters to this government. And it says it has an agenda about levelling up. But when you look and see what does that mean, the inequality they refer to is an inequality of productivity between different places. It's not an inequality in income. It's not an inequality in wealth. It's not an inequality in well-being. And so I think one of our challenges is to really try and combat and roll back this very narrow and misleading understanding of inequality, which the present government in London is pursuing. And actually which links into some of the, sadly, some of the what's revealed by recent public opinion surveys, which showed actually the majority of people don't think it's a problem who were interviewed if, for instance, COVID has gender unequal or racially unequal impacts, and they don't see, the only inequality they see as a problem is the inequality between the north of England and the south of England. So I do think this really challenges us in England when we're trying to make some headway with gender budgeting in the future. But having begun with that rather pessimistic note, let me go on to say something a bit more positive. And here I want to speak out of my personal reflections, and this might not represent what everybody else in the UK Women's Budget Group thinks, and they'll have a chance to add or put something different in their questions or in the chat. But this is reflections based on my experience as a member, an active member of the UK Women's Budget Group since about 2000, and as the chair from 2010 to 2016. And when I took over as chair, the Women's Budget Group only had one part-time staff member. It had no offices of its own, and it had difficulties in raising funding, and it had a very, very primitive website. So I think enormous progress on all of those issues have been made since 2010. So now we have a staff of 7. We've got Marianne with her wealth of experience as director. We've got a wide range of funders, including the Open Society Foundation, which is funding this particular meeting. And we've got a much more developed understanding of the importance of a 4 nations context. So organizationally, I do see some grounds for optimism, and that we have made some progress, even though the context since 2010 has not been a context which gave us many openings to actually change government policy. I also want to mention one of the key differences, I think, between what the UK Women's Budget Group needs to do and what colleagues in Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales engage with, and that's the issue of macroeconomic policy. Because fiscal policy and monetary policy are not fully devolved to the four nations, there's some devolution of taxation to a different degree in Scotland than to Wales and to Northern Ireland. But the purse strings, the major purse strings, are still held in London. And it's the Chancellor of the Exchequer in London who decides how much money is going to go from the national budget to Scotland, to Northern Ireland, to Wales, who decides when is it okay to have a budget deficit? When is it okay to borrow a lot more? When do we have to start having policies to reduce the debt and the budget deficit? And that means I think we have a special responsibility in the UK Women's Budget Group to focus on those macroeconomic questions, because they're going to shape the environment, the economic environment, the fiscal environment in which governments in Scotland, in Northern Ireland and in Wales operate. And so although I think in all of the other three countries, there's much more scope, there's much more interest in gender budgeting from the part of view of the government, and there's much more opportunities and forward thinking, things like on well-being, for instance, than there is in London. Nevertheless, there are constraints that are imposed by London on what can be done in the other three countries. And I think we, in the Women's Budget Group, based in London, we have a particular responsibility to bring the feminist lens to bear on those macroeconomic policy issues that shape the context for the whole of the UK. And I hope that's something we will carry on doing, and that we'll do this in a way that will be useful to you in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. And at the same time, as we learn from you, what can be done when you have a more open set of political opportunities than we do at the moment. So now I want to add a reflection on what I think has been key to the growth of the Women's Budget Group, and hopefully the other Women's Budget Groups and the other three nations will be able to experience a similar kind of growth in terms of staff, in terms of funding. I think what's been really key is the production of timely and well-informed briefing papers, UK budget assessments, reports, responses to UK government consultations, making use of quantitative and qualitative data, drawing on a wide range of expertise, particularly the pro bono expertise from the members of the management committee and the policy advisory group, academics and policy experts working in other organizations who give their freely of their time in order to help the UK Women's Budget Group produce the range of products that it does. And I think it's this expertise that's led to extensive media coverage, citations in reports of parliamentary committees, citations by women's organizations and other NGOs, because we're offering something that's useful to them. And I can see from the presentations that we've already had, I can see the expertise that's being used in Northern Ireland, the apprenticeships, and I know Scotland did something similar, and the expertise in Wales, looking at these learning accounts. And there's really good examples of the kind of detailed bringing together the knowledge of the policy context, the numbers from that will make sense of what the problem is and what needs to be done, and will speak to officials. When you can go along with that kind of clear quantitative analysis I think that really speaks to officials. I think to speak to the media and to speak to women's organizations at the grassroots, it's also useful to be able to link those numbers with stories. And I think that's something we've been trying to do in some of our work in the UK Women's Budget Group, so that you can tell some of the stories that underlie the numbers of people, women whose lives are being shaped by the inequalities that are stemming from government economic policy. I think we do have a challenge for the future in the UK Women's Budget Group in ensuring that we have an intergenerational transfer and development of expertise as people like me decide, actually, I'm 75 now, it's time to put down my computer, it's time to put down my pen and hand over to a new generation. And that's why I'm really pleased that Emily is on the same panel with me, because I can see that this challenge is being taken up, and I think it's something we do have to address. Another thing I would want to speak about is the intersectional approach that we've tried to develop in the Women's Budget Group over the last 4 years, a few years. Intersectional in our analysis, so that we recognize the diversity of women and we look at not only gender, but race and class as well. And the report we were able to do with the Runnymede Trust, called Intersecting Inequalities, I think was a good example of that, because we looked at the 10 years of austerity policies, and we were able to disaggregate the implications of this by gender, by race, and by class. And I think that had a big impact to be able to show how that could be done. And more recently, we produced briefings on migrant women, on disabled women, on Black and minority ethnic women. So they're developing awareness of the diversity of women, and that not all women are positioned in the same way to the structures of the economy and to economic policy. I think this intersectional approach has also developed into this Four Nations approach. And it was a great joy when I chaired the Commission on a Gender Equal Economy to have the meetings in Cardiff, in Glasgow, in Belfast, and to interact with the members of the women's budget groups there, but also with grassroots women's groups there, and to really get the sense of how things are different in different parts of the UK and how we have to take that into account. And it really made me look at every statistic I saw after that and say, is this data for the UK? Or is this just data for England? Or sometimes it's data for England and Wales, but not for Scotland and Northern Ireland. And I think that's something we really have to be aware of in the UK Women's Budget Group, to make sure we always very clear any data that we're using, statistics we're quoting, what parts of the UK does it cover? I think a challenge for us in the Women's Budget Group, the UK Women's Budget Group, which is in also a sense the England Women's Budget Group, is one we are now embarking on to develop further the work with local partners, building on the success of work in Coventry and in Bristol and the new local data project that Emily will talk about. And I hope we'll be able to do more work in the north of England, which politically is become really critical, I think, in the UK. But finally, let me say something about the issue of policy impact. Funders often want to know what's been your policy impact. And I always say, well, you know, the policy impact is always going to depend on what the political opportunities are. You can produce the best briefings, analysis, reports, websites, etc. in the world, but if there isn't a receptive government, you're not going to get all that far. And I contrast the experience I've had in talking to officials and parliamentarians in Scotland with the reception I've had talking to similar sorts of people in London. It's very different. And I look back to the years of the UK Women's Budget Group in the early 2000s, when there was a government that was more receptive to gender budgeting and to issues of gender equality and economic policy, where we would regularly go and have workshops at the Treasury with officials from the Treasury, and I think had some success in getting some changes in some of the policies where there was some overlapping of interest. That all changed in 2010. And since then, we've had a Conservative-led coalition government or Conservative governments which have not invited us to workshops at the Treasury and have not been interested really in what we have to say. So we've had to learn to work in that context, which is where there are less openings than I think you have in Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales. Working a lot with parliamentary committees, and the expertise of Marianne and of Janet Veitch on this has been really important to enable us to work effectively with all party parliamentary committees who have often quoted our evidence in their reports and have said, look, we must have proper gender impact analysis of the budget. Look, and here's the Women's Budget Group saying how it can be done and that you're not doing it. So those parliamentary committees have taken up that point and have made the call upon the Treasury to do gender impact analysis of the budgets. But the Treasury has not listened. So that's a closed door, but we still have to keep pushing at it. But nevertheless, you can often get unexpected openings. And this is my final point. Just recently, I was asked to give a talk to a network of young government economists across Whitehall who said, oh, we were asking a series of economists who are not in the mainstream to give us talks because we want to broaden our horizons about economic analysis and economic thinking. And could you talk to us about creating a caring economy? So I was amazed to get this invitation, but I did. And that gave me some hope that even when the front door to the Treasury is closed, maybe there are roundabout ways that you can have some influence, I think particularly on the thinking of a younger generation of officials might be the way to go. Just end by saying I hope we are particularly going to be able to work together in relation to the COP26 meeting in Glasgow in November, and I think that is something that's on the agenda for tomorrow.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much, Diane. And yes, you're right, it's on the agenda for tomorrow, and it's also going to be part of the work that the Women's Budget Group is doing with the Women's Environmental Network, which is part of our project around a feminist Green New Deal. So we're going to be at COP, and we've got plans for that. So finally, I would like to hand over to Emily Bell, who is going to talk about our local data project and work at a local level. Emily.
Thanks very much, Marianne. And I just want to say thank you, Diane, for saying that I might be the next generation. That's a massive compliment. So I'm excited to be here with everybody and tell you all about the project. So the local data project is more about what we can do to make gender budgeting work in practice, based on the lessons that we've learned from the different wonderful things that we've heard from the other speakers that are already in place around the Four Nations. It's a really exciting project that's based on work that the Women's Budget Group did in the past with the Coventry Women's Partnership, which is a group of women's organisations in Coventry. And my colleague Sarah worked with this coalition of organisations and wrote a paper on housing for women in Coventry, which was very well received and resulted in lots of requests for us to do more research at the local level, because within the report we used figures that were at the local level. And this brought to light two things really. Firstly, we capacity to do all of the calculations for everybody who wanted the same calculations done for them, and that most of the calculations in fact were fairly straightforward. So we decided that it would be better for everybody if we could share our expertise and help to develop the capacity and the confidence of local organisations to do their own analysis. So the Local Data Project was born. And as Marianne said earlier, the aims are to help local organisations to know how to access data, because a lot of data is publicly available, but it's not always easy to find. How to analyse that data when they've found it. And again, as I said, a lot of the calculations are quite straightforward, but it's knowing what those calculations are. And then how to use that data in campaigning and advocacy work. So the Local Data Project has a few different strands. We want to have a wide reach in what we can accomplish on this 3-year project. We started a pilot in January, and we have taken feedback on board, and we've expanded slightly what we want to include. So we'll have links to data sets that are useful, explainers on different topics, briefings on different policy areas, training support, templates for organisations to use, and we want to encourage networking as well. So how does this work across the 4 nations? The data sets that we use, we want to make sure that we're including the data sets from across the different nations, not just the ONS, which, as Diane said, sometimes it might only be data that is for England and Wales, or England, Scotland and Wales. So we want to make sure that we are including links to all the appropriate data sets from across the 4 nations. In our explainers, where we clarify concepts, we want to make sure that we are using examples from across the 4 nations. And it's really interesting to hear Diane say about it not being consistent, because when I was writing the fact sheet for local government, it was extremely difficult to keep it to a short, simple fact sheet that covered local government structures across the 4 nations, and then local budget decisions across the 4 nations as well. It's almost an impossible task. But we did make sure that we included examples from different areas, local areas within England, but then also within the 4 nations. I must say that Chwarae's State of the Nation report is fantastic, and so we've referenced that in one of our reports as well. Within the briefings, we've released our first briefing. This was in April, and we looked at the effect of coronavirus government support and the gendered gender differences in access to that. These briefings are then followed by training sessions on how to do this analysis for yourself at the local level. So we want to make sure that everybody has the possibility of producing their own analysis that they can use. And again, going back to something that Diane said, it may be that you have a broader impact on your local authority rather than at the national level. And so we really want to focus on the local in the local data project to make change. As part of the training program, we want to help people to know how to make simple visualizations for the data so that it can have more impact. That might be if you want to share it on your social media channels, for example. Here are some that I prepared with data for Yorkshire and the Humber region, because that's my local region. So definitely interested in making sure that the north of England is represented as well in what we do. We may also provide templates for people who want to approach local media organisations with the stories, and these are some of the media organisations that covered our first briefing on the coronavirus support scheme. You can see there that we had national coverage from the different nations. In the top corner, we've got the Daily Record from Scotland. In the bottom corner, we have Radio Cymru. And again, with thanks to Chwarae for providing a member of staff who could talk about our research in Welsh on the radio programme, so that reached another audience. So we really want to help organisations to know how to go about getting the message out there. And if they can use local figures to support the national story, then that makes the story more relevant where they are. And so basically, the main thing that we want to get across is that we need to work together to make gender budgeting work in practice. And that includes with the networks that we create. So all of these are ideas based on input and feedback from organisations we've talked to so far, but I would love to hear about your own ideas of how we can support you, because we want to offer a training programme that is bespoke to your needs. Whilst we will have some general training, like I said, to help people understand the briefings that we put together, we also want to help people with just how to access data in the first place, or whatever it is that the needs of your organisation requires. So my little plug here is, please email me if you'd like to know more about the project. My email is there. And you can also find out more about the local data project online, wbg.org.uk/LDP. And in the best stories end on a cliffhanger, so I'm going to leave it there and let you ask me for more information.
Thank you very much, Emily. That was great, and it's really exciting seeing that project turn into fruition, and seeing the kind of opportunities to get our work going beyond the sort of policy papers, which can have a fairly limited audience, to something that can reach a much wider group of people. So we've got about 20 minutes left for questions, and I can already see 3 questions come up in the chat. So I'm going to start with those. If people want to add in other questions in the chat, please feel free to do, but I'll take them in groups of 3 and then go round the panel. The first question with the highest votes, apart from mine saying this is a question, which I don't think we need to upvote anymore, is from Fatima. Do you want to come up onto the stage? Bring Fatima up onto the stage to ask a question. Is that possible? I don't know how this is going to work. All this new tech is very exciting, but is not always immediately straightforward. Yes, brilliant.
Much.
There you go.
Enjoyed. Thank you. Fantastic work you have done. So I from Iran, what we would like basically to take this gender responsive budgeting to Iran, but at first we need to raise awareness hasn't been implemented. So my question is, if we decide to have like social media campaign, how would you recommend to do that? I noticed, I took note from like, especially Emily, I understand we could provide fact sheet, briefing, so on and so forth. But I felt like because this is sort of budget, data, economy, so on and so forth, it's not so attractive to so many people. And so I don't know if you guys have done anything to raise awareness of like women's activists, journalists, policymakers. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. And I'll take other questions and then go to the panel. But just to say to you that Hannah, who is organising the conference, is also working on our local partnerships and training project, which involves working in partnership with different groups of women around the world who are wanting to promote gender responsive budgeting. So maybe she can get in touch with you via the chat or talk to you in the break. And talk a little bit about that project, because it might be something that we're able to talk to you about and support you with in more detail. So the second question we have comes from Andrea on the GLA. Hannah, is it possible to bring Andrea? Sorry, I've got these new varifocals, which makes it quite difficult for me to see very small type on the screen. I think it says Andrea Wilson. You don't all want to see a picture of my nose as I peer at the screen trying to see. Andrea.
Hi, Marianne. Yeah, I asked the question with reference to GLA, but I should probably have written several other metropolitan authorities as well. But in any case, do you think the GLA might be more open to gender budgeting? And if you do, how do we get started? And you could say the same about Manchester or Bristol or any of the other authorities with decent sized budgets. And then, although this wasn't my question, thank you very much, Emily, for sharing some ideas that might actually expedite that. So thank you.
Great. And finally, a question from Lucy. I think this is Lucy Stevens. It's not as quick as passing the mic in the real world, is it? Is Lucy still here?
Hi, it's me. I've invited Lucy, but I'm not sure.
Okay, so I will read Lucy's question, which says, please can I check when people talk of care, are you focused only on adult social care, or if childcare, both formal and informal, is also included? So we've got three questions. One which is about raising awareness, and how do you raise awareness in a situation where maybe there isn't that much awareness? Do we have models of successful campaigning? Secondly, around the GLA and other metropolitan authorities, is this is there more opportunities there? And finally, a question about when people are talking, and various people talked about work around care, is this specifically adult social care, or does it include childcare as well? So I'm going to go to each of the panelists in turn and ask you to answer some or all of those, but briefly, so we can try and get another round of questions in. Angela first.
Thanks very much, Marianne, and thanks everybody for the questions. I won't touch the GLA. It's very far from me in all ways. Social media and raising awareness. I think I touched on one thing that's really important, and that's about trying to demystify things, use language that's accessible, relates to women's lived lives, lived experiences, using infographics, using videos and short testimonials on things like Twitter and Facebook and whatever platforms that you have access to. And there's some fantastic resources, again, at the UK Women's Budget Group site, and the Making Women Count resource book there is really helpful on all of that. But I think any one of us would be happy to talk, and I include Sarah Cowan in that, on how we're using social media in our different areas. on care, when Scottish Women's Budget Group, when we talk about care, we mean unpaid care and paid care. We mean unpaid carers. We mean social care and support. We mean childcare. We mean the care workforce, and recognising the care workforce as a key sector of the economy and the value of care. So it's not a single singling out of adult social care, but what encompasses for us overall, which is the social infrastructure that is care and upon which we all rely.
Thanks, Angela. Anne-Marie, you're on mute at the moment.
Yep, I completely agree with Angela about demystifying, and I think that applies to policymakers as much as it applies to, you know, to any other person in the population. I think we were quite shocked recently for a group of policymakers to ask if we could reproduce, which we thought was a very user-friendly 4 pages in 3 paragraphs. So I think that there is a lesson there for all of us. With regard to care, yes, I think the social infrastructure is what we need to talk about. In the presentation, I had just referred to adult social care because that was specifically what we had done some analysis on around the apprenticeships, but the exact same arguments apply to all areas of care.
Thank you. Cerys.
I won't reiterate what the others have said because I agree. I will tackle the GLA only because I think it's an interesting question. We have a city region of 10 local authorities in South East Wales, Cardiff Capital Region. They've got equality sort of written in as a cross-cutting strand, but I sit on their economic growth partnership and investment panel. It's not embedded in the structures or decision-making processes at all. So I think it's exactly what Angela said at the beginning. It's how we shift them and challenge them and give them the practical tools to actually be able to embed that in their processes. Because I think there's some willingness there. We've seen, interestingly, just in the last week or so, our business district in Cardiff, which obviously is crucial to the economy of the whole of Wales, talking about wanting Cardiff to become an equality city or a feminist city. And I said, well, that's great. What do you mean by that? And they don't know. So I think there is that appetite, but it's, giving them the practical things that could be used. And then I guess what's interesting, this is why working across the 4 nations is so important, is that we can look at these various different models of devolution. So Greater Manchester has far more devolution than Cardiff Capital Region or Western Powerhouse or Western Gateway or whatever they call it. And we can start to do some of that analysis, through what Emily's talking about and others, and present that back, because when devolution was first kind of muted in the 1990s after people in Wales eventually voted for it, we talked a lot in those early years about how this was an incredibly amazing opportunity for us to learn from different parts of the UK in terms of what's effective or ineffective in policy implementation. We're often grappling with many of the same challenges, but we're taking slightly different approaches. But I don't always think we put time, effort and resource into sharing that knowledge and expertise. And we're certainly, in my view, having been knocking around sort of policy arenas in Wales for the last 20 years, have done the last 5 years. And maybe that's because in Scotland, they've had their own discussions about constitution. England has been particularly focused on Brexit and so on. But there's, I think, a challenge and an opportunity for us to get back into these kind of spaces where we can have those conversations.
Thank you. Diane.
Just briefly, Fatima, great question. Women's Budget Group produced a report called Women Count, which, among other things, explains the kind of strategy we had on social media. And maybe Hannah or somebody else could post a reference to that report in the chat, because I think it might be of a broader interest. And we definitely, with our new project on international partnerships, would be very interested to talk further to you and to anyone else, from, because I could see there are a number of people from other countries, from India, from Kenya, who were on the list of people participating in the conference, who'd be very interested to engage in discussions with any of you on how we might work together on some of these issues. On the GLA and other big local authorities, that's a really important issue. And I think one of our members, Sue Cohen, has done a lot of work in Bristol, particularly around the enterprise development, you know, the parts of the local government which don't think they have anything to do with gender because they're about economic development. And so I definitely think that's a place to work. But I also think we have a responsibility to also raise the questions about the ways in which local government is absolutely starved of funds, and austerity is continuing for local government. The only bits of extra money local government is getting are these personal pots that can be seen as the kind of largesse of Boris Johnson, you know, very much a pork barrel politics that we've not had before. The regular funding that local government gets is really, really continuing to be squeezed. And council tax, it really has to be reformed and changed. So I think we also have to work on those two aspects with local government, because even great local governments with great political leadership and lots of input from women's organizations are very constrained, more in the UK than most other countries in Europe, for instance, in what and the amount of money they have, the taxes they can raise, and therefore the scope there is for having better policies.
Thank you. And Emily, I know that you've been doing work with various groups working with kind of regional authorities, so you've probably got quite a lot to say on that.
I'll try and keep it brief. Yeah, Bristol, an amazing example of women making change happen. The Bristol Women's Commission, they got their agenda on the mayoral hustings. So, you know, they got the mayors to sign up to their agenda. So really great work. Definitely look them up. Greater Manchester, I know that there's lots going on in Greater Manchester in terms of pushing the agenda for women's representation, and also, you know, budgeting as well. As Diane said, there are some blocks to how much you can do when the only extra money you can get from government is ring-fenced for construction. Which, you know, goes against everything that we said in the Commission reports. But there are people in local government who are very interested and are working hard to push a caring economy at the local government level. So from what I have learned in my short time working on this project, is you are probably going to have more effect at the local level than you are at the national level. But I must say I'm slightly wary about saying the GLA is going to be open to gender responsive budgeting after the interesting carving up of the different committees last week, when the Labour Party kind of removed themselves from the chair positions, and so most of the economic committee positions are chair of economic committee positions are in Conservative hands. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there. Yes, I'll stop.
That's great. No, thank you very much for that. I'm just looking to see if we've had any more questions come in, but there are some. There's a questions that we preferred earlier, or questions that I just like to ask the panel to think on, and particularly how we can build campaigning momentum across the four nations I think about a lot. How can we build that momentum between us four partners where we've got so much policy divergence on some issues? How can we make that work? And particularly when different groups are going to have different opportunities that they really want to capitalise on. Does that mean people have to capitalise on that, or are there ways that we can still work together? I don't know if anybody has any thoughts on that. I might start with Cerys.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? You put me on the spot now. Any thoughts as to how we could do it? I've sort of said it's important that we do it, but not necessarily how. One of the things that I think was really powerful when we did the gender equality review in Wales was bringing expertise from a range of nations across the UK and putting them in front of officials and Welsh Government ministers so that we could facilitate that access to expertise from around the world. And they could ask direct questions about, well, how did this work in practice? What were the pitfalls that you could avoid? I think there's an opportunity for us to occupy some of that space around gender budgeting. I think there's appetite for that. I mean, Angela, you were involved in those sessions with me. You could see the light go on for some people in a way that I think just because they get so used to saying, well, you would say that, Cerys, wouldn't you? Whereas I think the independent expertise, learning from their peers who perhaps are further down the line, so people from Iceland, from across the Nordic nations and so on. So that one suggestion, I guess.
Thank you. Angela, can you tell us more about seeing the light go on?
It only flickers though. I think 3 really quick points. One about look to the common processes and the common issues. So equality impact assessment, the quality of analysis, the competence, the access to and availability of data. So where we have common issues, to exchange practice there. That links into the next point, which is about bringing together officials and politicians. So building on Cerys's point, I think there is real appetite at the moment, or there was certainly pre-COVID, from across Northern Ireland, Wales and Scotland to come together and to use that then as a challenge back to the Treasury and to other UK government departments to bring them in. And then between the women's budget groups, as well as with these, whatever level of government we have in our sites, to sharing the resources that we're all producing is such a strength. The Feminist Economic Recovery Plan from Northern Ireland, the Roadmap and Gender Equality Review from Wales, as well as the huge amount of material from the UK Women's Budget Group, all enormously important, nourishing, great resource, but does also what Cerys has been talking about, which demonstrates that we in our different pockets are not lone voices, that this is part of an international movement and it's part of movement within the four nations. And that, I think, gives us significant leverage as well with the devolved governments and hopefully the UK government.
Anne-Marie.
Yep, completely agree with what the others have said. I mean, I think mindful also of what Diane said, that whilst most social policy powers are devolved, most financial powers are held at Westminster. So I think that is something that we can coalesce around, around pensions, around social security in particular, and the disaster for women that's universal credit, because all devolved governments can do in relation to social security is to mitigate, and we really need to do more than that. So this is something, we have actually some things we can coalesce around which need to be dealt with at Westminster as well.
Thank you. Diane.
Following on from what Anne-Marie said, I also think about taxation and about the issue of taxation of wealth, taxation of capital gains, corporation tax. It's these tax instruments, although there's some variation on some of the devolved regions, on the whole, these new taxes that we want to see, like wealth taxes, equalizing capital gains and income tax, raising the rate of corporation tax. I think this is also something that we could work together on. And actually, at the moment, now that Joe Biden in the US and Janet Yellen in the US are starting to say progressive things about increasing taxation of the rich and increasing taxation of corporations, I think it's a good moment to also try and cooperate together on taxation.
Brilliant, thank you. I've got a slightly different question to Emily, which has just popped up in the chat, but I think this is one for you, Emily, which is how much knowledge of economics do we need to be active in gender budgeting? Who could be the members of this group? Emily, do you want to answer that one?
Yeah, thanks, Marianne. I was hoping you'd ask me that one. You don't need a background in it. I don't have a background in gender budgeting. I'm just a strident feminist. No, I'm new to this area of work, and I have been learning on the job, and my job is to make it understandable for other people who don't have a background in gender budgeting. So please, if you're interested, contact me about the local data. We can just have a chat and see what you can do, because I noticed that there was another question about what can an individual do apart from just emailing their elected representative. You can get involved in the local data project. You can ask your local council, you know, what did they do in terms of impact assessment? And if you don't know what an impact assessment is, that's okay. We can talk about that. We can have a conversation, and you can learn how to find out about it at your local level. So get in touch and get involved.
Brilliant. I think that is a perfect point to end this session on. Now we have a break for half an hour now, and I wanted to explain a little bit about how the break works, because we're moving into a different format in a minute. So those of you who were here before we went into presentation format will remember that when you first came in, there was a load of tables and chairs, but some people may have come in after that and so not seen it. So in a minute, we're going to come out of this format. We're going to go into what's called conversation format. Now, in conversation format, we've got 5 floors, virtual floors, obviously, each of which has got a selection of tables, and there's 6 seats around each table. So you can either have a complete screen break, which might be a good idea anyway, and stretch your legs and get yourself a cup of tea or go to the loo or whatever it is you want to do. But then you can find yourself on a table. And when you're on that table, if you switch your camera on and your mic on, you can talk to other people on that table with their cameras on and their mics on, as you would in the coffee break of a normal conference. And we're really hoping that this will be an opportunity for people to share kind of ideas and information and chat. You can have a look at the participants list, see if there's anybody here you particularly want to chat to, and see if you can track them down. You can send them a message and ask them where they are, or say where you are. If you don't want to talk to anybody, go to a floor where there isn't anybody, go to a table where there isn't anybody, switch off your camera and your mic, and nobody's going to bother you. And then we're going to come back at 3 o'clock for 4 o'clock, no, 4:30. Start again, Marianne. We're going to come back at 3:30. We're going to have half an hour break. We're going to come back and we're going to have the next panel, which is on the Commission for a Gender Equal Economy. So this is your chance to either have a proper break or to chat to all the amazing speakers and other amazing people who are at this conference. And there's lots of people from around the world. Find out more about them, share ideas, come up with good plans, plot and plan and strategize. And we will see you all back here in. Thank you all very much. And thank you very, very much to our excellent panel. Thank you.